This is my normal nap time, so I'm going to try to stay awake. You guys let me know if I start nodding off. You promise to stay awake too. It'll be a mutual, we'll help each other out. Go ahead and open up your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 8. We'll be beginning there in just a little bit. So that's Proverbs chapter 18. Proverbs chapter 18. We'll be starting there, but before we do, we've got a true story about a lady named Jane. Different Jane than our Jane. Jane, she drove home across a bridge, much like this one, every single day, hundreds and hundreds of times. But this one day, she saw something that made her stop her car in the middle of traffic. And she got out because she saw an elderly woman standing on the other side of the rail, looking down into the dark water, about to jump and take her own life. Jane got out and tried to say a few things, but nothing quite worked. She tried a couple of different things. Nothing quite worked until she said this one sentence. The woman looked and took her hand, and she was saved. Well, what did she say? She said, "I would like to hear what made you look so sad." She merely offered to listen. The first step in our communication strategy, as we're talking about evangelism and tactics and all this, when you hear tactics, just think wisdom. Whenever the Bible talks about wisdom, God is saying, let's think tactically. Don't just go rushing headlong into something where you're going to die. Let's be wise. Let's be smart about how we go about things. So the first step in our communication strategy is to suppress our desire to want to persuade or to correct the other person. What did Jane start out with? You don't want to do this. You've got too much to live for. The elderly woman needed correction, but that's not what got through. She merely wanted to listen. Eventually, that's what saved her life. The Bible places great importance on listening. We're going to look at a couple of passages in Proverbs chapter 18. We'll start in verse 2. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 2. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but in only expressing his opinion. In verse 13 as well, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. So it makes sense that, like if you're on Jeopardy and you say, Alex, I want, potpourri for 800. And then before he reads the question, you say, I'm just going to guess what the answer is. Obviously that's silly. Nobody would do that, I hope. So that's silly. But why is it also shameful? I remember in high school, years ago, I got to my biology class, and I saw my biology teacher. He had a shaved head. This was very unusual for him. So I made some silly comment, and I went and sat down. But what I didn't realize was something very terrible had happened to him recently, and he shaved his head as a way to mourn. And every time I think about that, it's been well over a decade, almost 2 decades now, I still feel shame and embarrassment at the silly thing that I said before bothering to understand what was going on in his life. It was just a funny haircut to me as a 15-year-old. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Some examples that hit closer to home. Husbands and wives, they're great at this, trying to finish each other's sentences. I won't name any names, but my wife in particular, no, we try to do this. She'll try to guess what I'm going to say, and I don't think she's ever gotten it right. But similarly, she'll be telling me a story, something that happened to her, and before she's even halfway into the story, I'm already giving my advice. And she's thinking, no, that's not even where I was going. That's not even what I was saying. And then there's frustration. Get to your point. I'm trying to, right? It's natural to do this, at least for a lot of people. And it takes patience and practice to break ourselves of this habit. But I believe, according to these verses and many others, that God expects us to. He expects us to try to change, to work to correct these habits. How can I tell if I'm a good listener or a bad listener? It's very much like driving. Everybody thinks they're way better at it than they really are. So if you don't know, even if you do know, oh, I'm a great listener, most likely the safe bet is you're a pretty bad listener. It takes a lot of work and a lot of discipline in a very mature person to listen well, especially when there's disagreement happening. But here's a self-test that might help us see if we're good listeners or bad listeners. Number one, do you listen to really understand, or do you listen only to come up with an answer? Are you able to suspend judgment while someone is saying things that are wrong or foolish or something you disagree with? Are you able to suspend judgment and see, let me put myself in their position. How would I feel? What would I believe if I knew and heard the things that they know and have heard? Am I able to suspend judgment, or am I only listening so that I can pick apart whatever they're going to say and find fault? There may very well be fault, but is that why we're listening initially? Or are we listening to gain understanding and to be wise about how we approach the situation? Do we concentrate on what's being said even if we disagree, or do we interject or tune out the moment something is said that we disagree with? Mom, I'm thinking about getting a tattoo, and then before there's even an explanation why or what the tattoo is, Mom, you know what Mom is saying, right? But a wise mother might wait and see what's going on, right? It's easy to listen when someone's saying something you disagree with or something you agree with. If you've ever watched a debate or read a debate, when the guy that you like is up there, you're like, yeah, lean into him, and you're like cheering him on. But when the other person gets up, whenever I find myself reading a debate book or watching a debate, my heart starts beating faster, I get uncomfortable, I start squirming in my seat, and I kind of just want to skip those chapters. I don't usually, but sometimes I'm like, oh, yeah, I know what you're saying, But do we concentrate even when something is being said that we disagree with? Do we follow nonverbals, tone of voice, expressions, or do we allow our minds to wander, or do we look at other things? If you're looking at your phone while someone's talking to you, or you're checking the time, or you're watching the TV, you're not listening. Even if you can repeat verbatim back to them exactly what they said to you for the last 10 minutes, if they don't feel like you're listening, you're not listening well. Especially if we're disagreeing about something, we need to give respect and give eye contact and give them our undivided attention. If we're checking the time when someone's talking to us about something important, we're not listening. We're not listening, even if we can tell every single thing that they've said for the past 10 minutes. Do we ask intelligent, clarifying questions, or are we quick to give advice when not asked? This one is my favorite in particular. One apologist said that he has this rule for himself. I ask them questions, and I keep on doing so until they ask me one. He has a rule that he will not make a statement when in a religious conversation until someone else asks him a question. He will only ask questions to allow the other person to speak their mind, and so he can fully understand what's going on in their mind. Because before he does that, he has no idea what to say. He might think he knows what to say, but he really doesn't. He asks questions and keeps on going until they ask him one. If you're a, well, here's what you should do type of person, someone who likes to give advice, here's what you should do. Determine to do the same thing. Don't ever give advice unless someone asks for it. It's not appreciated, it's resented in almost every situation. If you're someone who gives advice or jumps in and corrects or gives answers before a question is asked, people are going to shy away from talking to you. They're going to tell you less rather than more. They're going to close up rather than open up. If we're going to get to the heart of the matter, we ought not to do that. Are we open to the possibility of being wrong, or do we get defensive when challenged? We've all been wrong before, most likely. I know I have at least. But the funny thing is, right before I found out that I was wrong, I thought that I was right. Right? Isn't that how it works? Nobody believes something that they know is wrong if they're rational. But everybody thinks that what they believe is correct. And if we want them to be humble enough to consider our point of view, we need to be humble enough to consider that maybe our point of view is wrong. We have nothing to lose by examining what we believe. If we have the truth, we have nothing to fear. If we don't have the truth, we still have nothing to fear. We can only find the truth by examining what we believe. Do we not assume what's going to be said, or do we jump to conclusions, or do we want people to cut to the chase? You're wasting my time. Do we allow people time to explain nuance in their own words, or do we lump them into categories or tell them what they mean? Oh, no, you're a liberal. Oh, no, you're this, you're that. I know I have you pegged already. You don't even need to explain. Everybody has nuance to what they believe, and if we respect them enough, we'll allow them that time. So tactic number one, if we can even call it that, is listening to understand. Listening to understand. It's very difficult to do well, and we all think we do way better than we really do. Tactic number two, how do we listen if they're not talking? This brings us to, we ask questions rather than making statements. We ask questions rather than making statements. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 25 is a very interesting verse. There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. And how we typically use this proverb is we use it like a club. Let me tell you all the reasons why what you believe is wrong and how it leads to death. But if we do that, we're missing the entire first part of the verse. There's a way that seems right to a man. So I'm first going to try and understand, why does this seem right to you? Why is it that you believe what you believe? That's the first part of the verse. So we need to understand why we are where we are before we can determine where that belief is leading, don't we? There's a backstory to why people believe what they believe, and if we're wise, it's our job to draw that out of them. Only then can we dialogue effectively. If we don't do that, it's most likely going to be a monologue, and we're not going to get very far. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 5, the purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding, that is a wise person, will draw it out. Proverbs chapter 20 verse 5. Asking questions has multiple other benefits to evangelism as well. Number one, questions relieve the pressure, the need to feel like we have to know everything before we get started. We can get started wherever we are, however much or little we know, we can get started. One of the most intelligent and well-respected evangelists in the world, multiple doctorates. He's debated on large stages with the most scary atheists, the most world-renowned atheists in the world, many, many, many times. This is what he says. When they ask me something to which I don't know the answer, I don't try to pretend to know what I don't know. There's nothing more nauseating in people's eyes as an obvious attempt to answer a question when we clearly haven't a clue. And I think we need to be honest here and admit we don't know the answer, but show willingness to go and find out. We don't need to know the answer before we get started, but we do need to have the attitude that if they ask me a question then that I don't know, that I'll just be honest and I'll go find out. And maybe we can find out together. He continues that knowing a lot can actually work to our detriment. He adds, a lot of knowledge can stoke our heads up to such an extent that we become insufferable. Have you ever met someone who just knew so much that you couldn't stand to talk with them? We usually go through this phase in our teenage years and then maybe later, but they know so much, we can't tell them anything. We can very easily become insufferable because we know stuff. Number two, questions can show respect and care for the other person. Questions are basically the conversational embodiment of the golden rule, treating others the way we would want to be treated. Imagine that you're at a get-together with people that you don't know, and there's this guy, he comes up to you, and he starts talking to you. But he doesn't ask anything about you. He starts to tell you all about his nieces and nephews and his distant relatives and the boring job that he has and long and excruciating unnecessary details. All about him and his dentist and the root canal that he just had. What do you think about this person? Get me out of here is probably what you're thinking. You're only there just to be polite. And if you see him coming next week, you're going to try to find an excuse to get out of there. You're not going to want to talk to that person. But if, on the other hand, this guy comes up to you and says, what's your name? Tell me about your family. Do you have any kids? What gets you out of bed in the morning? Have you had a cool vacation recently? Tell me about it. you know what, I heard you're an expert in this field. Could I get your advice on something? Now what do you think about that person? They're the most interesting person in the room all of a sudden. The exact same guy. But if we ask questions of other people, that's how we want to be treated. We want someone to ask us, Jeff, why is it that you believe what you believe? Tell me why. We'd love that. Like, I believe one of the brothers said just a little while ago, someone said, yes, I'd like to have a Bible study. We'd pass out from shock because nobody almost ever wants to do that. Number 3, questions allow us to circumvent defensiveness. Questions allow us to circumvent defensiveness. Those long established walls, and it allows us to let the person convince themselves. They do all the work for us. Questions can mitigate what's called defensive listening. In other words, typically when people hear something they disagree with, they want to kind of tune out. But with questions, we engage, and that prevents the tuning out of something that someone would disagree with. Who is my neighbor? This is a very hot topic of Jesus' day. Someone asked him, who is my neighbor? Okay, and Jesus could have just flatly answered, well, Samaritans. But what do you think would have happened in the Jewish mind? This guy's crazy, let's stone him. At the very least, they would have been defensive. Most likely, there would have been an eruption. Okay? But what does Jesus do? He tells a story and then asks him, well, what do you think? And then the man didn't need a single bit of convincing. He knew the answer himself, but Jesus was wise enough to draw it out of him with a simple question. He didn't need any convincing. He saw it for himself, and he already knew it. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the Romans? Another very hot topic of the day. Again, Jesus doesn't just say, yes. He asks a question, and they answer for themselves. See, number 4, questions. This is what Jesus was doing. This is how he taught. Questions allow us to circumvent defensiveness, and it helps us get to the why of the matter instead of the what. So what people say, communication experts, what they say is, one of the biggest failings of communication in our day is that we only trade conclusions. Samaritans, yes, pay taxes. Rather than reasons why. Well, yes, Samaritans are your neighbors, and here's why. I'm going to tell you a story about this guy who did good. Wouldn't you want to be treated the same way? Jesus was trading reasons why and not just the conclusion or the end of the matter. So questions are largely how Jesus engaged with people who disagreed with him. In the Gospels, one person writes, Jesus asks many more questions than he answers. To be precise, Jesus asks 307 questions. He is asked 183, of which he only answers 3, directly at least. Here's the kicker. For every question he answers directly, he asks literally 100. If it's good enough for Jesus, I suppose it's good enough for us. What questions should we ask, though? It's really very simple. We alluded to earlier. Really only 2 questions. We want to focus on what do they believe and why do they believe it. These 2 are very similar, but they're of equal importance. It does us very little good to know the answer to one and not know the answer to the other. Okay? What do they believe? What would you say to someone who tells you, I don't like religion? I don't like religion. Is that the time to start convincing them? Oh no, religion is great because, X, Y, and Z, 1, 2, 3, all of these reasons. This is why religion is great, and you should like religion. No, we need to ask, well, what do you mean by religion? Not liking religion is like saying, well, I like food. Well, if someone says that, they don't mean, I like all kinds of food, because there's cannibals out there. There's people who eat like dirt and rocks. I've seen some of these shows. People who eat like bleach and soap. Strange things, right? So if someone says, I like food, we need to ask, well, okay, what kind of food do you like? Because I'd say I like food, but I don't like a lot of those things, okay? So when someone says, I don't like religion, we need to say, well, what do you mean by religion? What kind of religion? Because that's very, very vague. What if they said, I don't like religion, and we say, well, what do you mean? They say, I think flying planes into buildings in the name of religion is bad. That's why I don't like religion. Would we disagree? Or would we agree? What if they said, no, I think the overly emotional stuff is too much. I want to use my brain and think logically about the world around me. Would we agree or disagree? If that's their definition of religion, then I don't like religion either. What if they say, I see all these televangelists on TV stealing old people's money. I think that's terrible. I think that's terrible also. So if that's what they mean by religion, is there anything at all wrong with what they're saying? Maybe they're being imprecise, but that's really all we could accuse them of. Not at all. There's nothing wrong with what they're saying. In fact, we'd be right there beside them. I don't like that kind of religion, and neither does Jesus. Asking, what do you mean by that, should become like second nature for us. It should be reflexive. Even if we really think we know what they mean, we should ask just to make sure. And even if we really do know what they mean, we can ask for their own benefit, to get them to think through a little bit more of what they're saying. Just like what Brother Denham was saying earlier, someone said, I don't like doctrine. And probably Brother Denham knew exactly what he was talking about, but it sounded like the other man had no idea what he really meant or what doctrine meant. So, what do you mean by doctrine? Why is it that you don't like doctrine? Then we have a dialogue. Okay. Question number 2, why do they believe it? Why do they believe it? So, imagine someone says, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in God. If someone says that, again, this is not the time to start launching into, well, no, you really should believe in the existence of God because, X, Y, and Z, 1, 2, 3, we shouldn't just jump in like that. We need to ask, well, why is that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? We need to uncover why it is they're saying what they're saying. We probably know what they mean by, I don't believe in God. That's pretty clear. It wouldn't hurt to ask the first question. But at the very least, we need to know why they believe that. So, I don't believe in God. Okay, tell me a little bit more. Or why is that? Well, because my grandpa just died. Why would God let that happen? Do you think a 3-point syllogism would be effective on this person? Do you think they really need to grasp the necessity of God's transcendent eternal existence? Or do you think they just need a hug? They need someone to mourn with them, someone to understand. What if someone says, well, I don't believe in God because there's too many contradictions in the Bible? Do we start proving God's existence, or do we start addressing their supposed contradictions? We have no idea where to start until we ask, well, why is that? Maybe say, okay, well, great. If there were contradictions in the Bible, I wouldn't want to believe the Bible either. Can you show me one? We'll talk about it. What if they say, scientists have proved that the universe came from nothing out of the Big Bang, so that we really have no need for God. He's irrational. Well, if anybody could use a 3-point syllogism, it's that guy. So you can say that for that guy. But don't launch into your barrage of arguments just yet. There's one more tactic we need to consider before we start giving answers. Tactic number 3, we've listened, we've asked questions, we understand the nuances of what they believe, and more importantly, why they believe it. Now it's time to set them straight. No, not yet. Tactic 3 is controversial for some people, surprisingly, but we need to first understand, where do we agree? Where do we agree? This is eminently scriptural. Wisdom dictates that we should first find common ground. Why do we do this? At least 2 reasons. The first being that this clarifies what the point of contention is and is not. In the previous example, the guy who says science has shown God to be unneeded, he's irrational, all that sort of stuff, should we disagree with everything that he said? Or is there anything there that we could agree with? If we disagree first before clarifying what we agree to, we might come across as, no, yeah, we really support irrationality here in the church. Or, no, we don't like evidence, we reject that. No. We should first say, yeah, Christianity is a reasonable religion. If there's evidence out there, we need to follow it wherever it goes. We think that God gave us our minds and he wants us to use them. We ought to be rational. That's what God says actually in the Bible. Did you know the Bible says that God said, come now, let us reason together. Test all things. Hold fast that which is good. This is good. Encouraged by Christianity. If we do that, if we clarify, I agree with this, but this is the only part that we disagree with. That's treating him respectfully, and it's making our job a lot easier. Reason number 2, it makes it easier to change. The smaller that we make the perceived distance between us as Christians and the other person, the easier it is for them to accept. This is exactly what Paul's referring to in his great passage on evangelism in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He went to great pains to bring himself as close to the people he was talking to as he possibly could. To this group of people, I acted just like this. To this other group of people, I acted differently, same truth, but I approached it just a little bit differently. To this other group, the same thing. His goal, so that he might save some. He brought himself as close to them as he possibly could. One author says this, a wise communicator seeks to build agreements, not arguments. We're not that different, you and I. We come from similar backgrounds. We want a lot of the same things out of life. We only differ on this one point. Many Christians attempt to communicate with unbelievers with a mindset more like this, however. We are completely different people, you and I. We come from different worlds. I'm a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. You are from the domain of darkness. We think differently. We feel differently. We value different things. There's miles between us at that point. But that's not how Paul acted. Paul never acted as if there was miles between him and the people that he was talking to. I can't possibly have 5 minutes left. I'll have to speed up. So in Acts chapter 17, this is the perfect example of this. We see it in action. Acts chapter 17, to wildly idolatrous people. Paul doesn't start out, "Oh, you wicked pagans of Athens, let me tell you all the ways you're wrong." He could have said that, and that would have been entirely correct. But that's not how he started. He said, "Men of Athens." He saw them as equals, not below him. He treated them with respect and dignity. Then he gives them a generous compliment. He says, "I perceive that in every way you are very religious." Okay, he doesn't start with insults. He starts with compliments. Next, he doesn't insult their detestable, filthy pagan idols, even though he could have. He calls them their objects of worship. He doesn't quote the law of Moses. He quotes their poets, men that they know, men that they would respect. He talks on their level. He even notes that, in actuality, you and I, we're actually serving the same God, this unknown God. You're already serving him. Let me just fill in some of the blanks for you. That was Paul's approach. He first found common ground. He says, "We're not that different, me and you. We've actually got a lot in common. There's a lot that I see in you I respect." This was his attitude. Now, let me make the point that Paul did not stop there. He told them in no uncertain terms that they had to change, and specifically what to do, there as well as later. He did not stop there. That's a very important point to make. But equally important, he didn't start there. Paul did not start with the differences. He started by understanding them. He surveyed things that familiarized himself with them. He read their poets. He understood what they believed, and then he found common ground. That's how he started. And not until he did all of this did he start talking about, well, here's some of our differences, and they're very minor. You're already serving the right God. Let's just talk about some of the details there. Tactic number 4. We've asked great questions to gain understanding about what they believe, why. We've cultivated common ground after listening very carefully, and we found areas of agreement. Now is when we start sharing our point of view. But one important thing to keep in mind as we do this, that Scripture emphasizes over and over, is that how we speak matters just as much to God as what we speak. How we speak matters to God just as much as what we speak. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 28. The heart of the righteous studies how to answer. That a righteous person knows what to answer is assumed. We speak the truth, but what is not assumed is that we have also studied how we present that truth, how to do this. And this is not something that comes naturally. This is something that comes, the Proverbs writer says, with study. And we do this if we're righteous, right? How we answer matters to God just as much as what we answer. One writer says this: the Scripture specifically admonishes us to be gentle in our communication. In addressing those caught in sin, we're to restore them gently. Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. When defending the Christian worldview, we should do so with gentleness and respect. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. Regardless of how those who oppose us act, we're to gently instruct them. 2 Timothy 2:25. Paul states that his desire when confronting disobedient members of the church at Corinth is to have a gentle spirit. 1 Corinthians 4:21, rather than being heavy-handed in discipline. James says that if we're wise, and we ought to be, we ought to do things, whatever we do ought to be done in the meekness or gentleness of wisdom. James 3:13. Paul so emphasized this one character attribute of gentleness, of meekness, that he wanted us to be known to everyone far and wide for it. Let your gentleness be made known to all men. Philippians 4:5. Jesus, when he had the opportunity to describe himself in Matthew chapter 11, verse 29, The very first word he chose to describe himself is not mighty or holy or wise, none of those. He described himself first and foremost as gentle. And then he went from there. There are many, many other verses that emphasize the same point, but we end with this quote. There are plenty of resources that help Christians understand what they believe and why they believe it. And certainly those are vitally important. But it's equally crucial to know how to engage in a meaningful dialogue with a skeptic or a person from another religious viewpoint. It is not enough for followers of Jesus to have an accurately informed mind. Our knowledge must be tempered with the kind of wisdom that makes our message clear and persuasive.